Sriram, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before I ask you about your new fund, IndusAge, I wanted to take you back to your enormous experience in Intel and having set up Intel Capital. Share with us some of the deep experience you have gotten from Intel and the way, because when you started at Intel in terms of Intel Capital, you're still evolving. So it'd be good to learn from you.
Well, so Intel Capital, it was actually an evolution from the corporate business development activity, which Intel had in the early 90s. And we actually formalized Intel Capital towards the end of 90s, actually. And this was, as you can imagine, this was the great days of the first bubble, if you will. So we were learning, and at that time, Intel was investing probably in the neighborhood of about $10 million per year. And by the time I left, it was 2012, Intel was on a run rate of about $400 to $500 million per year. So, phenomenal journey, and clearly had seen multiple ups and downs in the cycle. The key learning, I would say, is that as a large fund, as a corporate VC, often you're either optimizing it for strategic value or for financial value. I think this notion that you can get a maximization on both those vectors doesn't always pan out, because you're invariably, if you're going to be investing in a company that is strategically very relevant for Intel, you're catching them much earlier. And when you catch them much earlier, then they are too small. And for a company that's too small to be engaged with at Intel is very difficult. It's this huge machine, and you've got two guys in a garage. How do they interface? So it's very hard. So you need to actually have companies at a certain scale before Intel can get involved in. And consequently, Intel doesn't do very well in early stage investing. So that was one of the key learnings that I took. And for me, I think that 20 years of experience really made me understand what to look for in early stage and what not to do in early stage investing. So consequently, this fund that we've created, IndusAge Partners, which is focused around early stage, is really about going after intellectual property, going after, how do we actually create something that has global value? And that's another plus that Intel had. Intel had a huge presence in 22 countries in Intel Capital. So we're trying to blend, the key learnings from, what not to do from early stage from Intel, and what truly the strength of Intel platform was, and try to somehow see if we can replicate that.
So there are many funds that have focus on early stage. And since you plan to invest here and as well as in India, I want to take the India story first. Going back to 2000 onwards, and everybody followed after that. They want to focus, but they can't focus on early stage because there's not enough ROI, or there's no ROI period. So they went with very mature
businesses, private equity,
sort of a thing. But now I think it is changing. The landscape is emerging with a lot of good technology, good entrepreneurs. So do you think now you hope to see a lot more traction?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because in the old days, everybody wanted to sort of go to India because there was Excel or Sequoia or Klein or any of them. They said, okay, we've been successful here in the Valley. Let's just extend the model. And for all practical purposes, they were two separate firms, even though they sort of claimed that they're one firm, because there was not really a lot of synergistic value that they were sort of mining on both sides. So that was one key learning, I think, at least as an outsider. That's something that I would identify. And the second thing was, every fund that was set up for Indian investments every fund was set up as a offshore fund coming through either Singapore or Mauritius into India. And consequently, they'd never had commitment from domestic limited partners, domestic companies that were committed to the fund. That's a huge mistake. If you really want to create companies that are successful, not just coming out of India for global markets, but in India, then you need to have the domestic corporates, the domestic big guys supporting it.
But wasn't that a way around to go against the very stringent legal hurdles there.
True, but that's why the fund, one of the aspects of the fund that we've actually created has a component of it which is actually an India-specific fund with India limited partners. So there are institutional investors that are actually backing that fund. And these are, I don't want to get into the big names at this point in time for confidentiality, but these are institutional investors that have large multi-billion-dollar businesses in India that are part of this fund. So I think one of the key elements is that you have to tap into the local ecosystem. And if you don't tap into the local ecosystem, you cannot get their commitment to support any of the investments that you made. That was missing, I think. And so this time around, quite a few of the companies, quite a few of the VCs are actually seeking local capital as well. It's not so much for the capital, it's really for their commitment to the platform. And that's a huge difference.
The other thing I wanted to touch base with you is when you're investing, again back to India, in the emerging entrepreneurs, the culture is very different. Although we tend to think that in the last decade they have learned so much from you, especially Silicon Valley, but still, when it comes to equity, they still don't get that holding on to equity as much as possible.
That's not actually true, because it's true in the sense that if you go after these family-owned businesses, which are obviously much later stage, or they are in a different cycle in the business itself, and they have that very protective, close to the chest kind of approach. But if you go to the entrepreneurs, these are guys, these are returnees from the US, and they've lived in the Valley, they have lived in Boston, and so they know how it works. So consequently, if I meet with CEOs of startups, they're totally okay with setting up an option pool for 20-25% for employees. So I don't see that issue in the next generation of companies, but the traditional companies, you're right.
Is that the portfolio you look for in terms of people who are returnees from here? Because there are also indigenous entrepreneurs who haven't had the exposure here.
There are.
Have the yearning to become an entrepreneur.
There are. I mean, it's clearly an advantage if you are a returnee. Then it's impedance matched. So you don't have to really explain a lot of things about liquidation preference and why a liquidation preference matters for an investor, or management. A founder at some point in time may not be the best CEO, and those sensibilities are a lot more acceptable if you're a returnee. But I think inherently, a lot of the domestic first-time founders or entrepreneurs, they want to be like the Silicon Valley VC. So if you tell them that we're a US fund and we're investing in it, this is how it works, I think you will see that there's a lot of receptivity to that. But it's the traditional large family businesses that become a problem.
What do you look for when looking for entrepreneurs? So when I talk to investors like yourself, they say, well, there are very many similarities between a young entrepreneur here and a young entrepreneur in India, or for that matter, other emerging economies. They're very savvy, they're very focused on technology, etc. So if you go away from the similarities, what are the differences that you see, one or two, and how do you meet up the challenge?
I'll tell you, it's almost a dichotomy, because I was actually there just a few weeks ago, and I was meeting with a bunch of entrepreneurs coming out of one of the incubators. And these are guys that are right out of the college, undergrad, and they are maybe 21, 22. So the similarity is exactly what you said of, they have the fire in the belly and they want to start something, and it's very similar to what you would find from a graduate out of Stanford or Harvard or something like that. The difference is, even though they have big ambitions, they're inherently far more modest and far more sort of unsure as to whether this can really become a global company, and that stems from, I don't think, lack of passion. It stems from just unsure. And here, failure is not frowned upon. I think the Indian entrepreneur is still getting used to the idea that if I'm starting this new company, it can't fail. They have not crossed over to think that, hey, this may fail, but guess what? The next one may fail, but the third one, I'm going to hit it very big. So that maturity is not there yet. But I think it's just a matter of time. It's just, the more they spend creating companies, and the more they fail, the better they get.
Right.
So that's the difference. The acceptance to failure here is much higher. Even in first-time entrepreneurs over there, that's not there, right? They're setting too much of a higher expectation bar for them to cross, which I hope they'll realize that it's a futile exercise, right? You don't need to do that, right?
The other thing is when you're investing in a startup, for the exit strategy is always at the forefront of your investment. Not everybody scores a home run for the IPO route. How would you advise to those you're investing with that what should be the exit strategy?
I think there are, you probably have noticed that there are a bunch of companies that have been acquired by US companies, Cisco and Facebook and Google and Intel, have all acquired Indian businesses. So I think trade sale is very much a possibility. The Indian markets are going through a fantastic time, and I wouldn't say the mainstream tech companies have actually looked at the Indian markets as a possible vehicle to list. But M&A is a very active area for a lot of these companies.
So Sriram, thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts, and wish you all the best for the first fund.
Thank you. Appreciate it.